Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to discuss the top two. It's A2, Broken Authentication from the Owasp top 10 list. Now this is the second of the 10 slideshows that I'm going to create for you guys about Owasp top 10. So let's go. So this slideshow will focus on the Broken Authentication for Owasp, right? And there are different things you could do on TryHackMe. I'm not a sponsor. However, I strongly recommend that you go to TryHackMe and register there because you can get a lot of free rooms for you to test about different things like broken authentication and so on. There's actually a room called Owasp Top 10 there, so I strongly suggest that you go and do that room at least. And it's free to sign up and TryHackMe. And if you wish, you can also subscribe to it, I mean, sorry, and get access to even more rooms. If you wish to use the slideshow as a teaching material, I strongly recommend that you look at the style called Action Learning. So the agenda today is we need to talk about broken authentication, how to prevent broken authentication, and the next time will be sensitive data exposure. All right, so your learning goal today is to understand how to follow security guidelines. So it's very important for you to actually open the Owasp top 10 list on the Owasp.org site, on the webpage, sorry, and actually read what it says, because many of my students usually do not look at the actual text, but stick to the slideshow. And that is actually a flaw. So I recommend you to actually go to the webpage owasp.org and look at the actual text and recommendations and click on the links and read everything in order to understand what broken authentication vulnerability is. So here's the sources. You have the owasp.org link, and the interesting source could be this one, is a development guide. So what is broken authentication? Broken authentication is just like this. Application functions related to authentication and session management are often implemented incorrectly, allowing attackers to compromise passwords, keys, or session tokens, or to exploit other implementation flaws to assume other users' identities temporarily or permanently. So this is the actual text, right? So what does all this mean? Well, there are many different things in area about broken authentication. One of them could be brute force. So if you can brute force your application or an application with some automatic credential guessing stuff, right, then maybe you should rethink the whole idea how you actually authenticate users, because if you have, for example, weak passwords, then a brute force would actually work really well. Credential stuffing require you to know something, require you to have some actual usernames or even passwords. Guessing session IDs could be another thing. Guessing a user session ID could be really bad. So if you can log on to a web page and check out its session ID and do that several times, and you see that there is some sort of similarity between the session IDs. For example, the last two numbers changed from 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, but that's a pattern, right? And if that pattern continues, you could probably guess another user's session ID, and then you can impersonate another user by just, well, go to the web page, create a user, log in with it, and use that new session ID, and then boom, you are another user. And if it's an admin or a user with a higher access level than you, well, then you kind of broke the application, right? So broken authentication can be many things. I think one of the more difficult things to fix is if you're using some old deprecated APIs. It can be very, very tiresome and a long process to change all your code to a new API, which is why I once again recommend using a really good abstraction layer architecture approach. So that's some long words. So by creating some good abstraction layers, I mean creating some really good classes that handle the actual communication let's say with the database. So using an old MySQL database API, which has some, let's say, broken features. If you created a class that actually is the only class that use that API, everything else around it is just some wrappers or some other classes to use this core API, then you can just change one class. That would be pretty easy, especially if you created it with really good interface design. So you're designing by the interface, okay? So, however, if you didn't do that and you're looking at some very old legacy code, like a few years old, maybe even more, with like thousands of lines of code, then I understand that could be really tiresome and a long process. This is where you really need to look at the job itself and say, listen, your boss or whoever is in charge, you need to do this because the application is really insecure. Stuff like unexpired session tokens or really bad forgot your password recovery processes or weak hashed passwords could be another thing. Bad password policy, keeping the length of a password. It should be like 16 characters. I would recommend 14, 16 characters. But if your user can go even longer than that, that's a good idea. So remember to rotate your session ID, and this should be explained. Whenever you change your security level, so whenever you log in, you're changing your security level from not logged in to being logged in. Let's assume that you're now logged in, and then you want to change your email address. Well, that's another step, so that's another security level. And when you do that, you need to provide some sort of, new way of authenticating yourself. That could be by the system sending you an email with a four-digit PIN. It's an okay way, but it could be better. Or even better if a user can do it with something the user have. Not something the user know, but something the user have. Let's say some RSA key generators or something that cannot be forged in some weird way by knowing something. But of course, it can be costly, and you also have to know your own limitations. So changing your security level should definitely rotate your session ID, right? So how to prevent broken authentication? Well, it can be difficult, of course, but nothing is impossible. So first of all, I would say implement a really good MFA, multi-factor authentication. So it doesn't matter if the first step is username and password, or if it's email address or password. It's kind of up to you what you want to do. Many people tend to do email address and password these days because email addresses are already unique. So it's not possible to have unique duplicated users. However, if you use email addresses as the actual username, then it's also easier to guess, because it's not that difficult to get a user's email address. If it's a chosen username of some sort, then it's a little more difficult. But I wouldn't necessarily go that deep into this topic about whether to use email addresses or to just use some name that you wish to use. So multi-factor authentication, the next step could be that whenever you typed in your username and your password, then you need to further provide authentication that you are the actual user and owner of these passwords. So many companies do it by, for example, sending an SMS code, which is okay way of handling it. However, there has been cases that reading other people's SMSs, was possible. So security-wise, it's not 100%, but it's definitely not that bad. Email could also be used. It's in the same way. It's not the most secure, but either it is not that bad either. So you can do like something like that. The best way to do MFA multi-factor authentication would be with some random key generator that could be on, let's say, a small device that you have at your home. press a button and boom, you have a key. That just takes, a lot of money for your company to set that kind of thing up. So many people therefore use a SMS or email solution for the second part of the multi-factor authentication. Now, do not use default credentials, and many people do that. Not necessarily many, but it's very common that whenever you install a new system and it's on like a testing stage, it's not really online, but it is online, but we haven't really launched it yet. It's still kind of pre-production, that kind of people, right? They kind of keep the default password for the root user. If you install some, let's say, older version of some CMS system or newer version, and some of them have some default credentials, and that's fine. Just don't put it online. Change it before you put it online. But other cases could be software shipped with default credentials. It could be Wi-Fi routers. It could be anything basically. But in the spirit of web development, I would say plugins, modules, CMS, whatever, stuff like that. Change the credentials. Don't use the default. Check for weak passwords. Well, yeah. Whenever you register a new user, I would suggest that you do not use the check your strength password meters, because there's been a lot of research looking into them that point to a direction that they have a tendency to have a weak area where you can actually escape the weak and the strong, so you can basically create any password, and whatever you write, it will tell you that it's a strong password, right? So of course it will make people think about, their password a bit more, I guess, but it could also make them a bit uneasy because they need to remember stuff. And this is another thing. People are really bad remembering passwords. So what can you do about that? Well, recommend use for them to use a password manager. Could be a one way. It's very difficult. I haven't really found any good way for employees or people to remember the password. But an old story was that make the user tell a story. So you take the first letter or the last letter in every word, and then you do something like, once upon a time there was a big bear in the forest and has 37 wives or 37 kids or whatever you want to make up like, and then you use something like that. But I'm not really into these kind of stories, but I have seen some things that work, but they also require you to be a bit more creative whenever you're creating your password story. Limit or increasing delay failed login attempt. Well, this is another thing about brute forcing, because whenever you have a possible brute force attempt on your application and you do not, remove the possibility to make it actually feasible to do it, then, it might happen that you're getting brute forced. So delay fail login attempt, put a delay on it, make the web application sleep for a bit, put in an actual delay for some milliseconds, let's say 200 milliseconds, and then whenever you fail your login, then make it 300 milliseconds, and then 400, and it will make the whole brute force idea really, well, it will kind of render it kind of impossible in many ways. So that's another way of increasing your security on the broken authentication part. Log your failures. So whenever you have a lot of failures, or just some failures where you change security level, for example, when you log in, or when you want to change something to your profile, let's say an image or your email address or whatever, then log whenever something fails. Put it into a log file and remove it from the actual web root and the server to that web server, and put it somewhere that no one can access it from the web application. So you can always go back to your log and see, well, what happened, what went wrong. Use a server-side secure built-in session manager that generates a new random session ID with high entropy after login. Yes, so that's the thing about whenever you change your security level, you should generate a new random session ID. So secure built-in session manager. Wow, that's a good thing, because many people talk about that. I would strongly recommend that you not create your own But if you're a student at a school, it's a really good exercise to actually try and create something that is good and secure, because it will make you focus a bit more on what not to do and what to do. So use of Recapture, of the Google Recapture, there's a new version, version 3. I recommend you use the newest version always, of course. It's a really good way to stop the whole, brute force thing. So let's assume that you actually create some pretty clever software that can click for you. Well, then if you also introduce delays on failed logins and so on, well, it will even make it more impossible for most of the attacks. So use the Recapture. Multi-level authentication, I think we should dig a bit deeper into what this is all about. So we have something called knowledge and possession and inheritance. All right. So the knowledge is something that the user and only the user knows. Could be a password. Possession is something the user have. Well, it could be the small device to generate a password, for example, like the RSA one. Or in Denmark, we use something called well, I could not say that in English, but it's a small piece of paper we're getting sent with some digits and keys on that is only one time use, and that's something that I have. But so inheritance is something user is, and that could be something like fingerprint, face, voice, or let's say iris recognition. So that is something that inheritance is. So how to do that? It's very difficult to well, the knowledge part is very easy. That's usually the first step on the multi-level or the multi-factor authentication. Possession could be the next step, or inheritance could be the other step. So depending on your budget and how many money you have, and the whole resource, devotion of your software from your company, you can choose inheritance or possession. That's kind of up to you which you want to use for the multi-factor authentication. Password length. Now, it's a thing, because if you go and read the NIST, the new NIST standards for passwords, there are some pretty interesting suggestions from this, that you should not make people change the password a lot and stuff like that. I would suggest that you allow the password to be up to 128 characters, because that's what the suggestions are, and the minimum of I would say aim for 12, but I would really like 16 length. And about this, you mix in small letters, numbers, and special characters. Letting people choose their own password and remember that is a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And you kind of need to understand that the bad thing about making people remember their own password is that if they're being forced to change it a lot, then you might end up having a password that's only changing 1 or 2 letters or digits, and then it kind of slip through the loophole of a new password, and that is not secure. At least it's not more secure than the other one. It's just it's not bad. It's just bad to do that. So if you really need to change your password, maybe you need to take a one-on-one talk with the employee and help them to create a good password. Of course, there are some password policies, and you can read in the Owasp, and it's stuff like you have to have at least one uppercase and one lowercase and a digit and a special character, and at least 10 characters, and at most 128 characters. And there are some other rules, but I really suggest that you go and read the actual Owasp document to get a full overview of how to create a really good password, or even read the NIST standards on the topic. This exercise is made for, if you like, it's a classroom, so you can go and do the Try Hack Me room, the Owasp top 10, and there is some broken authentication task. It's task number 6 and number 7. So remember, they are free to do, and I definitely recommend that you do it. So what I really want to say is that, you know, don't kill the messenger, right? Deal with the message. Every language does different, but the message is the same. So when you learn new technologies, when you learn new languages, um, basically they all have the same issues. You still need to apply security to all of them. There's no change at all. It's the same. So some languages might, you know, by default, if you call that method, then you know stuff is escaped properly to be outputted to a web page for cross scripting and stuff like that. But if you don't do that, well, it's not. So I haven't seen one single language or one single framework or library whatsoever that is just secure all the way. So you kind of need to well, every language does it different, but security is the same. That's my point here. So next time we will discuss A3 sensitive data exposure. So I really hope that you like this lecture on broken authentication for the Owasp slides with some different different way and perspective from what I learned, and I hope that you liked my lesson. So see you again next time.